Today we'll be talking with Thea Johnson, a Thomas C. Gray Fellow at Stanford Law School. She has worked as a public defender at the Legal Aid Society in New York City and was formerly a teacher at the American School of Quito, Ecuador. We will be discussing the issues her article, Latin Justice, A New Look, discusses, an article that appeared in our fall 2013 issue, Secrecy and Security. Thea, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So we'll just jump right in.
Your article discusses the major shifts in the Latin American justice system. Can you explain briefly what that main shift is?
So all of Latin America well, I shouldn't say all of Latin America, but the vast majority is undergoing a shift in their criminal justice systems. And the move is from an inquisitorial system to an adversarial system. Essentially what Latin America is doing is they're moving away from a system in which judges had all the power, did all the investigation, made the decisions, with very little contribution from defense attorneys or prosecutors, to a system that is closer to what we have here in the United States. We have a robust prosecutor's office and, in theory, a robust defense attorney on the other side. Those two sides duke it out in search of the truth. That's where we get the adversarial part of it from. And then there's a neutral judge who presides over the entire thing. The big shift is that their trials are now becoming public. So open to the public, with records for the public, and also oral. Things are not just being done on paper, they're now being done in public oral proceedings that you can attend, and that's a pretty huge move.
Why was the inquisitorial style the one that was initially favored in Latin America?
I think that there's a lot to do with colonial history, which a historian could probably tell you much more about. You know, the inquisitorial system does come from Spain. You still see the inquisitorial system in a lot of Europe, or you see a mix between the inquisitorial and the adversarial system. You know, one of the things is that the inquisitorial system takes a lot of power away from the people, and it puts it in the hands of the judiciary. Certainly, you know, part of Latin American history has been to move power into the hands of the political elite, and so I think that this is actually a sign that this is a cultural shift, not just so much in law, although it's certainly a cultural shift in law, but it's sort of a representative of a broader cultural shift.
Your article explains how there's so much distrust in the legal system and the judicial system in Ecuador and in Latin America in general. And you explain that changing from the inquisitorial system to the adversarial system, you know, making the system more public. Yeah. And my question is, how will that work if there's such deep-rooted distrust of the judicial system?
Yeah, well, I think it's a long process. This is not a panacea. This is not the secret pill that's going to solve anything. And although I do think in Latin America in general there's distrust, I will say, you know, state by state, country by country, it is different. But certainly in Ecuador there's a history of distrust of the judiciary. I think the transparency is the biggest thing. I mean, from my view, the biggest hope of what can come from this is that now everybody basically has to back up their decisions, right? If things are open, and if and a journalist could walk in, if I can walk in off the street and watch what's going on, that means that everyone from the prosecutor now who brings the charges, to the judge who makes the decision, to the defense attorney who is representing his client and should do that in a vigorous way, all those people have to account for their actions if their actions are in the public sphere. So, you know, is this going to solve all the problems? No, but I think it's a step towards creating an accountable judiciary, an accountable legal class.
And what has the reception been so far among lawyers and the public?
I think mostly it's been positive. You know, what I've heard, and particularly I went to Mexico this summer, and I particularly heard this in Mexico, the public hasn't really been involved in this process, and that's problematic. And certainly people are concerned about crime, and what you hear about in Mexico is people are concerned about the revolving door of criminals being arrested and getting out and being arrested again. That's something obviously you hear here in the United States also. But I do think the idea that people will be held more accountable is appealing, and certainly among I think among lawyers this is considered a good thing. Among the general public, I think from what I hear, most countries need to do more to kind of get out the word and say, here's what the new system looks like, here are the benefits of this new system, and here's what's going on. And this is actually quite a big thing, and people should be involved.
You paint a really exciting picture of what Ecuador's public defender's office looks like.
Yeah.
Just established, and it's filled with young lawyers, young people in the legal system who are eager to reform the system and who lack institutional memory. Can you just explain to our viewers what that entails and how that will change the reform process?
So I'm probably biased. I am a former public defender myself, so the second I went into the public defender's office in Ecuador, I immediately felt the energy you feel at public defender's offices. I ended up meeting with a lot of supervisors there, and as I noted in my article, generally young, mostly female, which I thought was a great thing. Really passionate people who are excited to work as public defenders, who think it's a great honor, who feel great passion about their client's cause, and that really resonated with me because I think that's what you find in public defenders' offices across the U.S. And the fact that they've been open just a few years and sort of already have that passion and that vision for what they are, to me is very hopeful. And what you hear over and over again is the people who tend to be public defenders, because the office never existed before, they tend to be young. They tend to be people right out of law school, and they don't really have any institutional knowledge about the inquisitorial system, and they don't have any loyalty to it. It's not the system that they were brought up in as lawyers. So they're quite excited for the prospect of learning the new system, and from what I hear are kind of the ones who have learned it the best, right? Who now know, something like cross-examination is a pretty fundamental part of the adversarial or accusatorial model. And everyone said, public defenders, they do cross-examination the best. And partly they do it the best because it's a brand new skill, and they're young and they're super interested in learning it, and they get it. So I think, their experiment with public defense is very heartening. And I think that area they're doing really well.
In your article, you mentioned that American lawyers have been helping train Latin Americans. What is the role of America in this?
Well, a big role. The U.S. has funded basically the initial stages of the transition in essentially every country that's made the transition. So Department of Justice and USAID have been the big funders. They continue to fund in different ways now. In some places it's more obvious, and in some places it's less obvious. In Ecuador, for instance, the American Bar Association is doing a lot of work in training attorneys. They are funded by the U.S. government, but you don't hear much about that. In Mexico, I went to a training that was also run by the American Bar Association, and every page in the training said, this is a product, I can't remember the exact language, or a gift of USAID. So making it very clear that the materials or the funding for the materials was made possible by the U.S. So, the U.S. has a big role to play here. Why they care to play a role, I think, is a very interesting question, and something that I hope to continue to work on while I'm here at Stanford, because I think you know, what's in it for the U.S. I think there's a lot of very obvious things, and then I think there's some less obvious things. Certainly, tons of lawyers going down there, doing these trainings, and trying to help people get on track so that they can learn, you know, how basically we do things here, because that's the model that they're adopting largely. I mean, in many places they're adopting sort of a mixed model, but the hope is to get to sort of a full accusatorial or adversarial system.
Can you give us any idea of what things America is interested in by training them?
Well, I mean, you know, the U.S. is always interested in crime in other places that may find its way to the United States, right? That's important for the U.S., and I think certainly Latin America is our neighbor, and there is concern that crime that originates in Latin America finds its way to the United States. If you can make the system there more robust, more transparent, better at dealing with crime, less corrupt, then that, I think, you know, in theory and in practice has an impact on the United States. You know, I think it also...
And, you know, the U.S. has been played as a critical role as a model for Ecuador's new system. But we see that in the U.S. we face problems such as overcrowding, racial disparities in the prison population. How can countries like Ecuador learn from both the successes and the faults of U.S.'s adversarial system?
Yeah. Well, I think that's going to be really a big part of what we're going to have to keep an eye out for, right? Certainly prison overcrowding is a major issue in Latin America. You hear about it, certainly I heard about it in Ecuador and Mexico, but if you pick up the paper, there are real issues with prison overcrowding. There have been some terrible fires that have broken out in prisons across Central America that have led to many deaths. So, you know, that's something that's a real issue here, and they're going to have to start thinking about there also. I bring up in the article plea bargaining. You know, plea bargaining is something that we do here. We now do it more than, that's how we resolve more cases than any other form of resolution, right? So almost nothing in the United States goes to trial. And what I argue is that Latin America should really pull back on plea bargaining, that they should not adopt it wholeheartedly at this point, because, you know, plea bargaining unfortunately preserves many aspects of the inquisitorial system. It's not an open process. It's a backroom negotiation. And what I would recommend is you want a lot of openness early on in the process, because that's what's important about this. That's the principle that this is all based on. Now, I don't think actually most of Latin America has adopted sort of U.S.-style plea bargaining. You know, certainly I've heard in Chile that there are all sorts of restrictions on how you can plea bargain, and I think that's great. I think, you know, countries should think about, well, what are the parts of the U.S. system that just don't work that well, and should we adopt those wholeheartedly, or should we take a step back and say, well, what do we want to do to make sure that we don't incorporate some of those same problems in our system? It's actually a great moment of experimentation. You know, there's something very fun about it. Like, if you were going to recreate or to rebuild a criminal justice system, you know, what parts would you take from different systems? And so I think that's kind of part of the challenge and what's super interesting about it.
And so what you're reiterating is that this is truly, you know, an experiment and an opportunity for the justice system in Ecuador and across Latin America to embrace, you know, the public space as a space for creating justice.
Yeah, I think definitely we'll need another 20 years to figure out how this is all going to play out. But right now, you know, I think there's a sense of nervousness, like, do we have the funding? Is everything looking right? But I also think there's a sense of excitement, and that was the feeling I got when I went to the prosecutor's office, when I went to the public defender's office, is the people on the ground have a lot of power to shape things. And the people I was talking to were pretty dedicated to that mission. And so in that sense, I'm quite hopeful. But I think, you know, let's come back and talk in 20 more years and see sort of where everything is, right?